everybody, and welcome to this episode of Theoryish. I just wanted to give us a quick heads up before you go into the episode. This episode is going to cover some difficult discussions around race because we're covering Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, which has some of the really difficult discussions. It's a very early text. And I also want to make a note about language. We won't be using the kind of historical language that Du Bois does. But if you go into the book, just expect some of this more historical language to be there because the book came out in 1903. Okay, on to the episode.
We turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
Open. I wanted to talk about your flip phone, Paola.
Okay, you have been such a hater about my flip phone manifestation, if you will. So it all started because we were watching these K-dramas and they had like the Galaxy Flip and I was like, ooh, I do miss that. And then we were watching Gossip Girl and I was like, oh, I miss like the little slidey phones. And I was like, you know what? I happen to lose things when I'm out partying the few times a year that I actually do it. So I was like, oh, what if I bought a flip phone? And the ADHD made me go into like a rabbit hole on TikTok of like, okay, what kind of flip phone calls to me? So I got one and it works. Hannah has been praying for my downfall.
How much was it? It was like no money.
It was like 40 quid.
Oh, it was expensive.
No, that included shipping from Spain.
Okay. So it was like 40 quid. Paola was like, oh, I don't know. I just bought it off this like random website. I don't know if this phone's gonna work. And then it came and it worked. I was actually surprised.
I may or may not have been flipping it in her face.
It's very sad because I kind of wanted Paola to bring the flip phone today so you could hear the flip, but unfortunately I forgot.
The flip and the click.
So, as we kind of said in the little content warning, today we're covering W.E.B. Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk, that was published in 1903. And we have dipbuk here as our guest. And I don't know if you want to give a little intro to yourself.
Hi, Hannah. Yeah, thanks. My name's dipbuk. I'm doing my PhD at Warwick University, Department of Sociology. At the moment I'm doing fieldwork, so gathering data, interviews, shall we say. And in my research I'm looking at policing and what happens when the body puts on the police uniform, to their understanding of power, identity. And I look at this from an intersectional lens, but I also look at the geography of where this uniform and interaction takes place with a police officer. So yeah, that's my research in a nutshell. And I came to this book, well, I read Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, and then I was introduced to this book by Du Bois a few years ago, and I thought, well, okay, let me just delve into this and read a few chapters. But then I had the opportunity to read it from cover to cover, and that was good. And so I think that this was almost like a progenitor to Frantz Fanon's book, which is why I found it interesting.
Did you like it upon the initial reading? Because I had never read this book before, and I was struck at how wonderfully, beautifully it was written. Let's start with that. It is a gorgeous piece of writing, but also just how relevant it still is. It was one of those where I was like, oh my god, let's see if this holds up. And I was like, oh no, this holds up a little bit too well.
Yeah, I needed to read the introduction before I started to go into the chapters. And that gave me so much context, and it painted the picture around what the book is talking about. And yeah, absolutely, it's so relevant even today, and I have to still keep kicking myself that this was written over 100 years ago, even over 120 years ago. So things have happened, but things have not happened as well, which is really interesting. And the other thing is that Du Bois makes reference to various things, just one-off names that are scattered and references all the way through the book, but then you have to actually look at those names, look at the context behind those names and look them up in order to get the actual feel of what the book is about.
Dipbuk, I can see you have a bit of writing. Do you want to read that?
This is just a reflection that it's a bit raw, but I don't know, now that you've invited me, I can't say no. Okay, so my African heritage is not visible on my skin. My accent does not indicate it either. Neither does it appear when looking at my parents or grandparents, but at a glance, either side of my immediate family lineage, and it is possible there could be traces. The sociology of phenotype is an interesting concept. Yes, Lombroso has indeed been responsible for egregious musings, but there are certain features which I would suggest are associated with certain parts of the world. However, I'm beginning to digress. My point is, reading Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folks leaves me wondering where this pain is within my body. I've cupped my head in my hands twice today already. I've had to take a physical break from this midway, not because of being tired or exhausted, but because of the pain evoked from reading this rich, mottled and dappled landscape of a book. I cannot breathe. I literally find it difficult to breathe at times. I'm fit and healthy, no disclosable physiological condition, but it is as if my lungs are trapped between four hulking rocks. Invisible as they may be, my lungs feel trapped. I feel like I cannot physically take in air. I type more and the constriction subsides. I take a sip of cool water and my body re-engages. It's over 120 years since this book was written, yet I'm feeling the souls of black folk whose blood, toil, bones and consciousness was desecrated. I feel my body yearning for the infinite where this pain is but a single molecule. But at this point, I'm still feeling the cells and antigens that guard me from physical debilitations. I realise my writing may not be beautiful prose or comprehensively presented in logical format with a roadmap for the reader to half-mindedly follow in a trance-like state, with the ability at the end to say thanks, I've read it.
I was going to say this is why I like talking to you, and this kind of why I wanted you on a podcast or a kind of episode, because you say, where was it? You say it's not like beautiful prose, but it definitely is beautiful prose. But you have this way of, I don't know, interpreting life and work, and I really think it's nice and beautiful.
You made me just now realize exactly why I felt so much reading this book. It's the frustration in his penmanship. Like, he is frustrated. And it's almost like he's trying to get as many words out as possible because this might be the only chance. Obviously, we're going to go into this. Du Bois wrote a lot, but it almost feels like desperate. It is rapid. It is almost violent in the way that the words are like being spat out. I don't want to call it violent either. It's like a plea, like, please listen to me. And I get you, at some points I was reading so fast because it was just like going into that pattern, and it was sort of dizzying. Certain chapters where it slows down, like the narrative, but there is like a rapidness. There's no chance to catch your breath. Every single line is chosen very carefully. So thank you for sharing, and thank you for like voicing what I really could not put together. Hannah, how did you find this reading?
Yeah, I think kind of like what you were saying, when it was first suggested, I was like, I wonder how relevant it will still be today. Like, so to put it into context, my only knowledge really of Du Bois, or like interaction with Du Bois's work, is in the history of sociological thought here at Warwick. It's a module, and Du Bois is part of that module. It's taught part of that module. I haven't taught on it, but that's the only interaction. So I felt like it was almost like this very historical thing in my mind. But it is still really relevant. It's hard to pinpoint exactly how it fed into future work. We're going to attempt to in some ways today, but it almost feeding into everything, you know what I mean? It's not just feeding into a specific line of inquiry. It really just is this beginning of kind of knowledge around Black studies and African American studies and all this kind of stuff. So, yeah.
I think it also goes beyond just the field of like history and sociology. We were speaking about this, and it goes into economics, and it is a work that each chapter was like a different field.
Yeah, it's as I read through it and going through the chapters, I then started to realise that actually what he's trying to do is form an argument that this souls of black folk is an argument as if he's being called to defend something, to speak about a whole race, a whole nation, a whole community of people, that have been othered.
Yeah, because this is, without going too fast into like skipping over things, he is writing this at a time where, this is post-Civil War. There is time to sit and start looking at the past. Of course he's haunted and infuriated and desperate for these things. Of course he is. It is recent.
So this episode is going to be slightly different from other episodes we've done where we cover a text. We read most of this book, and we wanted, actually, after reading it, to spend the majority of this episode really contextualizing both Du Bois's life and this work within the context of the kind of time period and the space in which Du Bois is writing. And so, I guess without further ado, I'm going to start by talking, and as I mentioned before, feel free to jump in if there's anything I'm missing or not saying or anything like that. But I'm going to give an overview of Du Bois, and then Paola's going to kind of give an overview of the time period and the context, and then we'll go into talking about the book a little bit more. So, Dr. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, commonly known as like W.E.B. Du Bois, if you see a book anywhere, that's usually what's written, was born in 1868 and died in 1963, so lived a long time, through a lot of, we'll see it in a minute, but a lot of intense historical moments.
Tumultuous.
Yeah.
He literally saw the making of modern America.
Yeah, which is intense, yeah.
To say making sounds like people are just going there and calling it America, but there's so much more that's going on within this time period that it's the words that he writes and the way that we describe it doesn't necessarily do it justice. It's a project, I think.
Yeah.
It feels like.
So Du Bois was an Africanist, author, educator, editor, scholar, and sociologist. He fought against discrimination, lynchings, slavery, racism, and segregation. And he was extensively involved outside of more academic work. He was extensively involved in more civic activities and kind of international efforts to build a Pan-Africanist movement. So Pan-Africanism, if you do not know, was the attempt to create a sense of brotherhood and collaboration among all people of African descent, whether they lived inside or outside of Africa. So what's really interesting about Du Bois is you get this more global approach to his kind of studies. So he was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, like I said, in 1868. And this was 3 years after the conclusion of the Civil War, and it's only 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Du Bois is very well educated, so he went to a number of different universities, and it's really interesting for the time period. So he went to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and then he completed his bachelor's degree. He transferred to Harvard College and enrolled as a junior. And in 1890, he was awarded his BA degree cum laude from Harvard. He then gets supported by a scholarship from the Slater Fund, and I did a brief look up at like what this was, and the Slater Fund was essentially money that was put aside to support the education of African American people. So he gets a scholarship from the Slater Fund and he attends the University of Berlin, and he travels throughout Europe from 1892 to 1894. And then interestingly, he was actually awarded his PhD in history in 1895 and was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard University. So what happens to him then is, after getting his PhD, he's not offered any employment at any white academic institutions, and he goes on to teach briefly at Wilberforce University, which was a historically black college in Ohio.
I went to uni in Ohio, and so as a side note to everything we're discussing here, my former BA university, which is Ohio State, I wanted to see what they had for Du Bois. And not only was there a project at Ohio State for Du Bois's works to be available for free, but also the library had a really great study guide for this text that obviously we'll include in the show notes. But it did help us question and engage with this text a lot more. So I thought that was a really nice connection, especially given what's happening currently in Ohio in the year of our Lord 2023.
So yeah, he's teaching at this university, Wilberforce, from 1896 to 1897. He then also gets employed by the University of Pennsylvania to conduct a social survey of Philadelphia's black community. 1897, he gets appointed as the Professor of History and Economics, interesting like what you said earlier, at Atlanta University. So while we're talking about Du Bois, it's really important, I think, to acknowledge the complexities of his character, especially, he lived such a long time, the complexities of the politics he kind of held. So he was actually seen as a problematic figure to the leadership of the civil rights movement. Interestingly, in 1963, at the March on Washington, the leader of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which we'll refer to as the NAACP, the leader, Roy Wilkins, in 1963 announces Du Bois's recent death, and he actually states, quote, the fact that in his later years, Dr. Du Bois chose another path. And I'll kind of explain why in a minute. But by the time of his death, he had actually edited 4 journals, published 20 non-fiction works, 3 autobiographies, 5 novels, and numerous articles, editorials, essays, and creative works. So Du Bois is doing a lot. And this doesn't even include everything he did really outside of academia. This is us winnowing it down, I guess. So he was the founding member of the NAACP, which was founded in 1909, and it still exists today, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And so what happens in the 1930s, which ends up with him being kind of a controversial figure, is he reverses his stance on segregation, and he states that the separate but equal idea was an acceptable goal for African Americans. So the NAACP leadership actually asks him to retract this statement, and he refuses, leading him to resign from the NAACP. So yeah, it's complicated.
It's extremely complicated.
Very complicated. But we'll hopefully unpack some more of this as we go through as to why these complications might exist, I guess. So, interestingly, also in 1951, the US Justice Department arrests and tries Du Bois unsuccessfully on the grounds of being a representative of the Soviet Union. This is during the kind of McCarthy era.
So McCarthyism basically was the senator that post-1945 was inciting the beginnings of the Cold War era. So anyone and anything that spoke against capitalism, this is also a very big summary. These are sweeping statements for brevity because this is going to be a long episode. But McCarthyism basically spread throughout the United States, and people were being watched and their phone calls were being tapped, their works were being revisited, And Du Bois, from day one, has been yelling about socialism and later on Marxism. So he would have been an easy target, especially as a black man.
So, yeah, like you were saying, during this time, his books were actually frequently removed from libraries because they were deemed examples of communist-inspired propaganda. A few years before he gets arrested, in 1949, he actually purchases the printing plates and rights to Souls, which is what we're reading today, from the publisher for $100, which would be about $1,270 today, because he was concerned that Souls might go out of print and he didn't want that to happen. So after he's arrested in 1951, his passport gets seized by the US State Department and is withheld until 1958. He leaves the US to travel to Ghana on October 5th, 1961, and it's expected that he would eventually return to the US, but he doesn't. He becomes a citizen of Ghana on his 95th birthday, mainly because the American embassy refuses to renew his passport, and so he essentially gets kept out of the country. A few other little tidbits that are important to kind of mention. Du Bois, as you might have gathered, has an odd form of conservatism, and it's really interesting to read Souls because you can see this really coming through. Du Bois, as far as I'm aware, starts to get really interested in Marxism, but then is also dealing with this kind of elitism that is happening. Manning Marable, who writes one of the introductory essays for the copy that we read, and in this essay says, quote, Du Bois has given the emerging black middle class a lyrical language of racial reform, end quote, which I think really sums up this kind of conservativist ideas.
Yeah, it's a really odd form of conservatism in which we can't really police. It is neither religious, nor is it overtly misogynist. There is misogyny, but that's also the time period. But it's a big je ne sais quoi. Like, it is just there in the room.
I don't know which chapters it is, and we'll go through them as we progress, but it's as if education is withheld for black people, and to the point where there is almost a thirsting and a yearning. They are so deprived. And then once education is allowed and that they are able to learn and go to schools, to high schools, to universities, that once that option is available, they grab at the first thing, and that is education as it has happened to white folks. And they grab at that and think of that as their token within which to gain an agency into society, into US, into what is being called America, the United States eventually. And I wonder if that, because they have grabbed at the first thing, that first thing is conservative education in its elitist kind of way.
Yeah, it's definitely like a raft of survival, because being too opposed to the system would mean putting your life on the line. But even within his conservatism, like, it already puts a target on him. If he becomes a full-on radical, what would have been his chances of survival? So I think this is why we're just having all this time to sort of put him together, and then we're going to add in the historical background, because many different things are happening at the same time. This book is a product of its time, but it's also the establishment of this time.
So Du Bois kind of defined himself as a sociologist, and then it made me think about when sociology was even used. So to just give a brief little historical note on that, sociology as a term was first used in the 1830s, and then it was taught by the name sociology for the first time at the University of Kansas in 1890 by Frank Blackmar. And the first academic department of sociology was established in 1892 at the University of Chicago by Albion W. Small, who in 1895 founded the American Journal of Sociology. So Du Bois is, I guess, already familiar with this use of sociology. What is really interesting and kind of is what you pointed out before we started recording, dipbuk, is the way Du Bois approaches the sociological method and sociological writing, I guess. So he's almost doing what we would now define as kind of an autoethnography.
Autoethnography is where you look at your own positionality and interrogate your position within the world that you're around, your lived experience. And as Du Bois is writing this book, as we go journeying through each chapter, we see the path that Du Bois is taking through all of these essays. And yes, he's not writing in the evocative style of autoethnography, but I could see that it's a reflexive piece, and he is seeking to see his own positionality within the world that he's in, but also talking about positions of other people within the area, the Georgia state, and then Albany, and then the larger parts of the US that he talks about in the book. So I think this is I didn't realise and anticipate that this would be what I think as being an autoethnographic investigation into the souls of black folk. But that's how it sounds to me, which then also leads me to understand why and how Du Bois can be contradictory and complex in his character, because this is how humans are. We are not consistent, we are contradictory, we do have many facets.
Jumping off what you're saying, dipbuk, he also consistently used first person throughout all these essays, but other works as well. And he also used empirical data. So sometimes you'll see throughout this book him almost like geographically mapping the landscape of the American South and black people in the American South. And so kind of just last on Du Bois as a person, he is also intensely interested in literature, and you can see that throughout the book in the way he includes songs, in the way he talks about literary text, the way he even writes. And another essay at the beginning of the book, the version we read, is by Charles Lemert. And Charles says, quote, "When Du Bois was inventing his very distinctive brand of poetic sociology as politics," end quote. And I think that very nicely defines Du Bois's work and approach to the work.
As you say that, I was thinking, when reading the way that the book and seeing the way it's written out and laid out, my brain was thinking of Maggie Nelson and Bluets and the Argonauts, in the way that it's not just text, he's got music. For me, it was almost as if he was querying the way writing is done and presented with the use of these different facets and means of communicating. And even just looking at, for example, when he quotes Omar Khayyam in one of the chapters. Sorry, this is probably a little bit slightly off topic, but we've mentioned this before in the sense that his character is interchanging, and Omar Khayyam writes a poem called A Moving Finger, where he says, "The moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on. Nor all your piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all your tears wash out a word of it." So what he's saying is that once you've written something, you move on and you'll come on to the next idea or next thought, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you follow a linear trajectory, that it can be meandering, it can even be regressive.
So now we spoke about Du Bois, Let's think about when the book was written. So the book, just to clarify again, was written or published in 1903. So yeah, Paula, take it away. Give us a history.
This is going to be an extremely brief history because a lot of things were happening in the States in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But one of the big things, obviously, is prior to Du Bois's even being born, was the American Civil War ended. So the American Civil War granted black men the right to vote and to be freed. And it's something that especially is a problem in American academia. It's usually brushed off as like, and then they were freed. But Du Bois is growing up in a time where people are toggling with this change. Because overnight, a person that was not seen as a person has now become a person. And these newly freed Black people do not have land, they do not have finances, they do not have anything. But Du Bois is actually quite lucky in this regard. Du Bois is born into a family in the North with their own skills and trades. And even though the situation was less than ideal, he's coming in with a very Northern mentality. And it's something that is still even currently now a struggle within the United States. Northerners and Southerners have different culture, and that sort of trauma is still lingering. But at this point, this trauma is being cemented. So a big problem I had with sometimes with Du Bois was the way he wrote about the South. So in the South, things are not going great. So the Confederacy is dismantled, but these people are still out and about. So between the years of 1865 and 1872, we get the Ku Klux Klan. So it was formed immediately after the American Civil War. Let's make a big note of that. And it started off as like a fraternal white-only club in which they were trying to promote Southern ideals, which is white, anti any religion that's not Baptist. So they also hated Catholics, they hated Jewish people, they hated everyone. And they wanted to establish what was yet to be called white supremacy. It was formed in Tennessee by 6 former Confederate soldiers who created the Klan but didn't really give it a figurehead. It was sort of formed as a social club chapter. So there'd be like a chapter, and then they would introduce it to another town, and that town would create another chapter. And they were not really talking to each other per se in the first wave that changes later on in the 1920s when it's reestablished again. But these chapters were growing throughout the South, and they became insurgency groups. So these groups were also supporting the then Democratic Party by either threatening or even killing and lynching opposing Republican members. At the time, you also have to remember that the Democratic Party is what we call the Republican Party now, and the Republican Party now was the Democratic Party. Very confusing, I know. They called themselves the Invisible Empire of the South and committed obscene hate crimes. And they would dress in what we would stereotypically associate Klansmen with, which is white robes with a cone-shaped hat. And some of them used to call themselves the ghosts of the Confederacy. However, the Klan began to lose support from their political backer, which is the Democratic Party, because President Ulysses S. Grant introduced this act in 1869, I believe, that was like, hey, no more of this. And then the Ku Klux Klan was like, no, we're going to continue. You can't stop us, until the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, where it says, quote, where individuals and states were punishable under federal law for hate crimes or disenfranchising citizens on the basis of race. However, it's not like the Ku Klux Klan also went away. So it stopped the formation of the Klan. So a lot of articles say, and the Klan ended here. No, what happened next is very frightening, and something that is broken up in a podcast I really recommend called Behind the Police. But a lot of these Klan members then became police and they became judges. So they implemented what we now see as Jim Crow and modern police. We're going to go into Jim Crow a little bit later because it is mentioned in this book. But I wanted to really establish that because especially the way Du Bois is talking about Atlanta and the South, I understand where he's coming from, where he's feeling very frustrated. But this was the daily reality of people in the South. And these things didn't go away. So there is embedded trauma. So all this is occurring. And then in 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court, in its Plessy versus Ferguson decision, established the legality of separate but equal standard. This is going to be mentioned, of course, when we discuss Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington. We're going to be building up on that, so I'm going to sort of skate past this. But something I really wanted to establish as a historian of war and a historian of First and Second World War, in 1898, there was the Spanish-American War. It was only 1 year, but this was extremely important because it established the US as an imperial power for the first time. So not only did the US get Guantanamo Bay and Puerto Rico, it also got the Philippines and Guam. The African American community at the time really supported the rebels in Cuba, and that also made a huge impact in the vision of the African American people versus their own government. So these things are being cemented and reiterated. And then at the same time, so all of this is happening, and we get to 1903, where we have the first transatlantic radio broadcast from the States to England. So all this is occurring, these racial tensions, but there's also the advancement of communication. You get the illustrated press for the first time. Photography has developed significantly enough where people can have pictures of their family members, they can make it themselves, and the news is starting to adopt photography into it. So there is a changing and shaping of what reality is. So this book is coming out at a huge point of advancement. That's why I'm saying it's the making of modern America. It's America as an imperial superpower. It's America as a source for information. And it's also America creating its modern police force. So all these things are happening while Du Bois is writing. And I don't think it's surprising that this seminal work is coming out for the first time, that international communications being established. We have the telegraph. Houses are starting to put electricity into their homes. Times are changing, and yet some things are staying in the past. And that's why I was saying that that frustration is happening with him, because he's seen the world change, but not the United States.
Yeah, and as you say that, I think that Du Bois's unique position is that he is, yes, elite educated, but his skin is not. And so he's treading this in and out, this emic and etic, this view on the outsider and then on the insider. He's an elite, but yet he's black. The first educated person, yet everyone around him that looks like him is not necessarily as educated if they were lucky to receive any education at all. So he's treading these two lines. So this double consciousness, as we'll come onto later on, is starting to develop within himself.
Yeah, I need to find that quote, because I have a good quote from the text that could be a good transition. So the quote is on page 89 on the text. If you're reading it online, is in the chapter called Of the Sons of Master and Man. And the quote is thus: "One thing, however, seldom occurs. The best of the whites and the best of the N-words almost never live in anything like close proximity," end quote. I found that this very short quote was especially haunting because it was so succinctly put. It's just there is an obvious inequality between the elite within a black society and the elite within a white society, and those two cannot occupy the same space. And it is his increased frustration. He's the first black person to graduate from Harvard with a PhD. He has credentials, if not even better credentials than most of the white men he's competing with these jobs in. And yet, he's halted by something he cannot shed off, and that is his skin.
I think he's alluding to class, but class is something that works differently as these societies are developing. On the one hand, one could say that the whites elites have a middle class identity, but then educated black folks, do they have a middle class identity? I'm not sure. Do they have a working class identity? I'm not sure. It's almost as if there's a class that's developing in a different way. It's a different animal. so to speak.
Yeah, because there's like macro class structures, and then within that, there's like obviously the white class culture, and then there's the caste system of anyone that is non-white, and then within that there's other communities. What I think is so important is also he does mention Cherokee people. He mentions Native Americans, he alludes to Mexican people. Also, this is after the Spanish-American War, so you're also seeing Latinos in the United States a lot more. You're seeing Chinese people come into California to work on the railroads and become a new servant class, where it's paralleled with slavery. It's not the same, but it's running quite parallel to what Black Americans were suffering through in the United States. But he's talking about his own people because it is such a complicated situation. What is class when you didn't have anything just 40 years prior? What is that? What does class look like? And then here comes this very elite, well-educated, rounded, Europe-traveling Black man. And he's like, I have things to say. He's such an interesting figure. I think we keep going back to it, but it's the truth. He's quite rare in this time period and so outspoken that we have to provide enough time to just look at him.
Before we kind of go into, because we've been kind of doing it now, we're starting to go into it, but just some logistical stuff, I guess, for people that are interested. So the book is written as a compendium of essays. So it's different essays that were written between 1897 and 1903. And it's fairly short if you want to read it, because it's very readable as well. As we mentioned earlier, Du Bois has like these very literary leanings, and what is also happening within some of these essays, there's certain references to different literary figures or specific, I guess, textual classical leanings. You know, Charles Lamert in the introduction says that Souls has a kind of Elizabethan sort of prose. We were speaking about it earlier as, you know, when we were talking about the whole elite thing, I guess, is would he potentially have done this to get his writing taken seriously, right? Like, he wants people to read it, he needs people to read it, like you were saying earlier, yeah.
And that's probably why he's got these other people that he's not only got music, but he's got poetry, he's got other very elite, very well accomplished writers and philosophers and poets and musicians.
And he's also referring to friendships that he established while in Europe.
Yeah.
He's referring to a lot of people of German class and aristocracy, and also the language that he's using. Yeah, we were comparing it to Francis Bacon and those Enlightenment writers' style. It's very purposeful. He wants to cement himself amongst the elite. And honestly, he delivers. This text is short, but it is engaging, and it's also very academic. This is not something that is for people that are not learned. It is establishing and cornering a market.
Even the titles of each of the chapters, it's as if he's taking inspiration from Bacon's of the interpretation of nature, and just the way that Bacon's book starts with of, Du Bois starts in the same way. And Bacon was an Enlightenment theorist, and now Du Bois is seeking to be a sociological theorist.
And then there's the question of, like, was this a manifesto? To which I say no. I can see where it can be interpreted as a manifesto. He includes so much of himself, and it is sort of a call to arms, but it's not explicit. It's more of an argument about what is currently happening in his contemporary time. Did either of you see it as a manifesto?
I think if it was thought of as a manifesto, that would be in a pejorative way. The way that I read it, I think of my time prosecuting, and when I would build a case, I would have to argue in defense. And I think of this book in a similar way. Du Bois is seeking to argue that the souls of black folk are worthy of benefit, have agency, are powerful, that they can lead to greater theories and thoughts of what emancipation means for a greater amount of people than not just black folks.
But I wonder if it's read. So the reason I had to think about the manifesto in here is actually, I can't remember who it is in the introductory essay, calls the first 4 chapters very specifically a manifesto or a manifesto type of writing. And I wonder if it's almost read as a manifesto because it's fighting for rights of a certain group of people, right? So it's almost read as a manifesto in that way, but that doesn't necessarily make it a manifesto. It's just being seen as that, you know?
Well, yeah, I think also coming from the episode we did on Valerie Solanas, where it was definitely a manifesto. A manifesto has a plan, has a structure. A better comparison would be the Communist Manifesto. It is a literary work. It starts off with like a specter is haunting Europe, the specter is capitalism. I can see where the flower writing can be similar, but I don't think this is a call to arms. I think this is someone going, no. This is going on right now. You should feel something about it. But feeling something about it and doing something about it are 2 different things. He is trying to push forward his own narratives that we're going to break down soon. But it's like you said, he's constructing a really articulate argument and even referring to his opponents and saying, no, this is what they're doing, and then he's going, however. So it's more of like a debate that he's having within the entire text. Yeah, but I agree. I think because he's describing the horrible times of his present, people take it as a manifesto, and it's like, no, he's just saying people should care.
So the book's kind of laid out like I was saying. It's the compendium of essays. The first 4 chapters are kind of establish Du Bois's thinking, including his method and kind of an overview as well. And then the following 6 chapters is really a mapping of the Black American South. And then the remaining 4 chapters really delve into Du Bois's personal experiences, including the death of his son and things like the colour line and a social map of the Black Belt. And what's interesting, actually, when you were saying earlier about this role of class, so in 1953, there was a Blue Heron edition that came out. Du Bois kind of went back and forth on whether he wanted to edit the words inside the text and really, like, essentially write a new book with this as the basis. But he chose to just revise a few of the phrasings and add a short introduction, which was in the version that we read. So the book was largely the same, but when Du Bois was preparing to do this, he is on record somewhere, I'll see if I can find it, as stating that Souls didn't actually anticipate the rise of psychoanalytic theory and did not focus on the role, really. It does have elements of class in there, but he wished it was more ingrained in the whole discussion.
Yeah, and I don't think it would have benefited him. I think this is a controversial yet brave opinion. I don't think changing what he wrote would have done anything with this. If not, I think it would have made it worse. Because I feel that this book being from 1903 cements how important it is. The inclusion of class, the inclusion of psychoanalysis would have dated it in a way I don't think would have been recoverable. I don't think this would have worked. However, taking some notes, some pages from his book and style of writing. However, there is the counter of it is not talking about Black women. It is not talking about how class and how classist societies in the North and South are still permeating. There are elements that we're missing. However, I don't think that changes the entire impact of this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking to myself, would Du Bois have come across Harriet Tubman? And I anticipate he would have, but...
Died 1913.
Likely. Okay, here's what I'm going to say. Likely, but Harriet Tubman was a figure that was extremely important during the war, but she had a lot of emotional and physical impairments.
He does write about Harriet Tubman later when he does a biography of John Brown in September 1909.
Good boy, Joe Brown. Literally fighting people left and right. Best friends with Harriet Tubman. Always had a gun. He said, "I will kill any Confederate on sight." He was like, "It's on sight." He taught his sons how to shoot Confederate officers. He was part of the Underground Railroad, and he established a house in Circleville, Ohio, so that when Harriet Tubman crossed the Ohio River, the first stop would be his house, he secured the movement of enslaved peoples from Ohio to Canada. Du Bois and Harriet Tubman meeting would have been interesting, but I don't think it would have changed anything.
No.
Because he also speaks very highly of Frederick Douglass.
But again, hardly mentions Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. And also, the book is less about... I would say it's even less about slavery and more about, like, the aftermath. Knowledge of the American Civil War is vital to the background of this book, but not really its focus.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the elitism of Du Bois.
I wanted to kind of start our meaty discussion of the book with a question that I had, and they tried to answer it in the essays beforehand, but I was still a bit confused. So I wonder what you two thought. So at the very beginning of the book, I believe, Du Bois refers to the reader as gentle reader. And so Lamert, who writes one of the introductory essays for the book, states, quote, "The gentle reader of souls is a Victorian fiction, as was the superficial gentiality of its author's prose." But essentially, this idea of Du Bois kind of being aware of his audience and appealing to the audience. So I wondered what you two thought about it.
So I think dipbuk and I were in the same boat for this one, where we thought the gentle reader was going to be the elite white person purchasing this book, because this is not an easy read. It is easy in terms of you can pick up what it's trying to say, but it is laced in flower and it is dressed up in a way that if you do not have higher education, it would be kind of difficult to pick up the argument. Especially it is dressed in simile and metaphor and prose. It is beautiful, but I think the gentle reader is the white person that he's trying to get on his side. I was thinking about a black person, another elite black person reading this, who's not Booker T. Washington, engaging with this work, and I wonder what their response would be. I think it would be like, yeah, I know. But a white elite person does not think about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that at the time he's just starting to broach upon the subject of black people receiving an education, and I think in order to do that he has to appeal to a certain type of person, a certain race of people, a certain class of people, and in order to do that he's got to be able to communicate and form this bridge, and this book is almost like a conduit that is able to then communicate to the people that he needs to get onto his side or bring onto his side, as opposed to bringing on Booker T. Washington's side. So it's the gentle reader. He's trying to appeal to the more benevolent character of powerful, white, educated people.
Even just the usage of the word gentle, like gentleman, and it is laced in Victorian fiction. It is also laced in Victorian pleasantries, because he's trying to, we were saying this was the sugar before the medicine goes down.
Yeah.
So this is him sweetening the palate and then going for the gut punch. So he is preparing his reader to be in for a roller coaster. He's strapping them in.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's the reason why he's in his writing. He's not always like I had to really look at these names, and he doesn't necessarily delve into the character of all the people that he mentions. Often he'll just trot out a bunch of names, but not necessarily. And I wonder if there's a reasoning for that, in the sense that he doesn't want to upset people's more delicate constitutions and sensitivities, so he'll just not be too explicit.
Yeah, what's it called? Like, he's subtweeting.
Yeah.
Du Bois is subtweeting. I think with that we can also start heading towards double consciousness.
So, double consciousness, which dipbuk was referring to kind of earlier, I guess, is defined in the text. I think it's like page 2, so it's super early, and it's kind of dropped in and not unpacked wholly in the text. It's more like throughout the text as a whole, and I think it's unpacked in further of Du Bois's works, because double consciousness is one of the things that Du Bois is known for. But on page 2, he says, quote, "This sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity." And he later on says, in this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. So he talks really about, the way I understand it, and maybe I'm wrong, but it's this sense of the way you're read and the way you're perceived, and this kind of older sense of who you are and who you have been, and the way these things are not matching up. And he almost argues he doesn't want them to be merged, because then you would lose what you gain from both things, or you lose something from both of these things. He says it in a better way, and I didn't write the whole quote, which is terrible of me. Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, I would say it's almost like it's like water and oil, how those two things are not supposed to go together, yet somehow he is both those things. He's Black and he is American, but it's not supposed to coexist. And suddenly now it coexists. And it is what is lost with the merging of these two things. Will one win over the other? And he's making an argument that it's also equally important to have these two identities, because he is Black, but like, what is his nationality? Mm-hmm. He cannot reference to his ancestors. He has no idea who his ancestors are. His ancestors were forcibly removed from their original lands into this new country. And this country is full of hate and spite, but it is his country. And then by embodying America, he's being told that he's not supposed to be Black, and yet he is. So it is two contradictions just swirling inside of him, and now miraculously they're coexisting. So no, I think you're 100% correct, Hannah. Mm-hmm. It definitely is sort of that, like, mirror to mirror. How can a mirror see its own reflection?
Yeah, he says the veil of colour are changing rapidly. Such a double life with double thoughts, double duties, double social classes must give rise to double words and double ideals, and tempt the mind to pretense or revolt, to hypocrisy or radicalism. So yes, it's not just this double consciousness, but also this double life, this contradictory way of living that is tearing at his soul, tearing at his consciousness. So it's a very evocative way that he's trying to explain this predicament that he's in.
If you don't mind me mentioning, this is also sort of how people approach diaspora. And like, I'm Puerto Rican American, and those two things have increasingly felt more at odds recently politically, and a lot of people of ethnic backgrounds in the States, they put their nationality first, and then it's a dash American. So it's Indian American, Native American. These things are, that double consciousness is still in the zeitgeist. And I find it fascinating that he's talking about this and not feeling both. And then you have African American, and people that are not African American are just referred to as Black.
Yeah.
or Black American.
Yes.
It's always a separation, but you don't see white American.
No, and they are referred to as opposed to being able to say that I am.
What you've just read about the kind of double words and double ideals, this is what I mean by like Du Bois's work. You can see it kind of scattered throughout loads and loads of different works, because it reminds me of, and I don't know who coined this term, but the idea of code switching, which you will change the way you speak and the words you use to be read in different ways. But yeah, you know, that's essentially what, in my mind, that's essentially what he's talking about, that like double life almost.
And this is also not where I think double consciousness also shows up, is even within white structures for class, where if you were raised in lower white class and then you're suddenly thrown into academia to fit in within the ivory tower, you really have to code switch. You cannot be speaking like you speak with your family or your relatives, because if not, you're not going to be taken seriously. So in a way, the double consciousness can even go beyond the confines of ethnic studies and into a bigger picture of how we function in society, and how these two things are, how difficult it is to balance out these two identities that are the construct of the self. Like, these are the baselines of a person. I just, Du Bois.
Yeah. In my mind, it links me to the work of Frantz Fanon, when Fanon writes from this psychoanalytical perspective of the self and the contradictions and the pain and violence that can happen as a consequence of seeking to understand one's own self.
And this also makes sense why Du Bois was feeling kind of conflicted about introducing psychoanalysis into this book. Once more, like we mentioned earlier, it would have made sense to include these things in there, but I think having the very early definition gives it more plasticity.
So I guess the kind of thing we're doing right now is we're taking some of the words that Du Bois is using, so double consciousness. The next one I kind of want to talk about is the use of the color line.
I saw that the connection with the color line was really highlighted on page 110. I forgot which chapter it was, but the quote is the following. "Someday the awakening will come when the pent-up vigor of 10 million souls shall sweep irresistibly toward the goal," which is in capital letters, "out of the valley of the shadow of death, where all that makes life worth living, liberty, justice, and right, is marked for white people only." End quote.
Yeah.
I think that really establishes what he means by the color line. It is the introduction of all these liberties and justices and of this progress, but only for a specific class. And it doesn't mean the same thing because there is an existing color line. And he's sort of repeating for liberty and justice for all, which is part of the Pledge of Allegiance. Yeah, wait, I know it by heart because indoctrination. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, for the republic for which it stands. Yeah, for the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So he's saying liberty and justice for all also includes us. But you cannot say that if all has an asterisk at the end.
I thought it was interesting to see you and listen to you do that, in that it's all, you had to pause, and it's almost as if it's muscle memory that you're delving into. You're relaxing, and then you recite these words that come to you only when you relax, as opposed to when you have to consciously try to think about it. And it's almost like it is indoctrinated into your soul.
And it is. So, like, as I've mentioned in multiple episodes before, but if it's the first time, my education when I was in Puerto Rico was Catholic education, but then we moved to the United States, and I went into Florida public schooling. And you were forced to learn the Pledge of Allegiance, which is, I think I did it really fast, so I'll do it slowly. It's, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and for the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This is something we had to say every single morning before class started. And you put your hand to your chest and you look at a damn flag in a classroom. And you do this. So obviously, this is before Black schooling was really established. But these are words that he probably had to read over and over and over and over again. Even on our money, it's like, in God we trust, and all these things. And he's seeing it in the currency. He's seeing it in legalese. He's seeing it in classrooms, and he's going, for who? Who is all? I want to know who that is, because we're not included in that all. So the color line is definitely the division of the liberties given to people, but also the funds that come with that. So a color line is visible specifically in the South when white people use their taxes for their neighborhoods, for their schooling, for their white-only park spaces. And when you look at Black neighborhoods in this time period, they were not as well funded. There were some neighborhoods that were quite self-sufficient because they had established a lot of businesses. There's a rise in family-owned businesses that have been inherited. There is a history behind Black funeral homes and Black funeral traditions, specifically in the South. So there's also a color line in tradition. I think it's interesting that the next point would be like beyond the veil, because there is a sort of veil covering this existence where like they cannot coexist. It goes back to double consciousness, but this is like double community.
Yeah, just as you say that, I'm thinking Black folks in the South had to pay rack rent, and rack rent is the maximum amount of rent that is possible that a person is able to pay. And many of the people Du Bois goes through it in the chapters, they are having to pay this rack rent, which is extortionately high, debilitatingly so. Some people are only able to live for 6 months of the year, and the rest they are indentured. And then he also mentions the fence, which again denotes boundaries and ownership, but fences are not possible. It seems like that's not possible. They are not possible in Black-owned spaces, which then makes boundaries much less visible.
Yeah, and it's going to that, even that like suburban quote that is bigger fences make for better neighbors.
Yeah. So
it makes me also think about these sort of sources of these quotes. I know the sourcing of the word picnic is but like would this quote also stem from this era of like creating a boundary between the Black neighborhood and the white neighborhood? There's a specific chapter in this book dedicated to debt and how debt becomes a new form of slavery, because white supremacy can no longer own their bodies, so they're going to own their finances and their way of living.
I was just going to bring up the next concept that you were talking about, which is this idea of the veil. And a quote, I think this comes from, let me just double check, I think this comes from the original, the forethought. So this is before he goes like into the book, I believe. But he says, quote, "Leaving then the white world, I have stepped within the veil, raising it that you may view faintly its deeper recesses, the meaning of its religion, the passion of its human sorrow, and the struggle of its greater souls." End quote. And so the way I kind of saw the veil is similar to the color line, right? Where you can feel this divide, like what you were saying, dipbuk, about the boundaries. You can feel these boundaries. But the veil is interesting, the idea of a veil is something you can see through. So you can see almost this other side, or this other life, this other way of living, but you can't access that. What's interesting about Du Bois is, in some ways, he has access to this world through his education. And so when he's talking about raising the veil so that you may see in, I think he's talking both to a white audience here, saying, look, you can see the kinds of things that, when he's talking about gentle reader, right, you can see the kinds of things that you're not seeing on your everyday or you're not understanding.
There's also, this is going to be going more sources of this phrase. I found here that the veil is actually from Hebrew tradition, and it is a curtain that covers the main body of a temple from the tabernacle, and it then becomes the process of dying. So going beyond the veil is also going towards death. And I don't think he did this without that insinuation. I think going beyond the veil is also going towards the death of something. So would it be like the death of the color line? Would it be the death of Black culture as it is now to go to the beyond, which is an equality? So the death of the current structures. So I think also his crossing over to white spaces is sort of also the death of his own old identity, because now he holds a passport for both of these spaces. I think he's being very clever here with calling this a veil, and especially the word, the literal, because I couldn't shake it, and then it finally hit me. But going beyond the veil is something he's writing verbatim, and he knows what he's saying. What do you think?
Yeah. My mind was going to corporate law and thinking of the concept of lifting the corporate veil, which is where if a company has an identity limited company, then you lift the corporate veil to reveal the directors behind the name of this company, which is itself an identity. So when he talks about white society being shown when the veil is lifted, and he talks about the veil throughout numerous chapters, this phrase, this concept being used perhaps from law or perhaps from even Latin, I don't know, law or something or other. But it just shows that he's not just a sociologist, but there are various facets to his character and learning that make him the sociologist that he is.
On page 37, he also has this quote where he says, "From the sight of the veil that hung between us and opportunity." So he's almost also seeing, as far as I'm reading it, this veil as both an opportunity and, I guess, like what you were saying, it is the death of something, which is interesting. But I was going to say that, again, bringing Du Bois into the present, which we'll kind of be doing more in the next episode, hopefully. I think this idea of like double consciousness, the colour line, beyond the veil, is really all speaking to something that I don't think is named at this point, which is white supremacy, right? It's all this...
Peggy McIntosh talks about white supremacy writes about white supremacy in the 1980s.
So, white supremacy, according to the Google definition, is the belief that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion or detriment of other racial and ethnic groups. What is difficult, I guess, about white supremacist thinking, and this isn't something that's gone away, lots of what Du Bois is talking about is just as kind of relevant today, is this idea that white supremacist thinking, it's not as obvious as being a specific line or this kind of veil. This is why he's trying to bring words to it, because it can impact in very large kind of legal structural ways, but it can also impact in smaller ways, in interactions between individual people, in who gets space to speak about what and stuff like that. So what are your two thoughts on it?
When you mention that, I think of that the education part is that the education that he's had, one that he's fighting for, is counter to what Booker T. Washington is fighting for, and the education he wants is for, in the same vein as the talented 10, is that right?
Yeah.
When he speaks about various people that are very accomplished, they're also black folks. And I think that what he's trying to suggest is that black folks are just as worthy, just as capable, just as able, and have just as much potential to achieve elite levels of education, but that education is not necessarily critical of itself. This education is a white education. It is an Enlightenment education. It's the kind of education that he is seeking to promote, which is this Francis Bacon type of education.
When you're kind of talking about education, an example I can give of like how deep this whiteness, I guess, is rooted in the way we exist today. Even the conception of human nature, so the idea, I used to teach on a module about this, so I'm drawing into the past of my mind, but the idea of human nature was defined by Europeans, and specifically European explorers when they came into contact with racialized other people. And so they then had this conception of human nature and what human nature was, and then when they came into contact with these other people, they said, oh, well, if you are this, you don't match up to my version of human nature, so I am human and you are not. And we still use the phrase human nature today without potentially realizing the weight of what we are saying and what we are drawing from when we talk about what it means to be a human being, you know?
It also speaks about the way we think about history as a series of progressive points in time. There is no such thing as history being a stream of enlightenment. No such thing. Things go in and out of vogue. Things come and repeat themselves and they just wear a different face. You don't suddenly go, well, we liberated black people, so now we've advanced as a human race. Have we? No, we haven't. So history doesn't progress. So it's also this iteration of excellency, of not questioning the foundations that made the contemporary. It's why a lot of people now have been speaking of, especially in Canada, they talk about the land that they're standing on, because there is a history there. There's a really horrible thing that occurred for that building to be there. Same thing in the US, same thing here in the UK. How many battles were fought to create Warwick University? The entire Midlands was bombed to smithereens during the Second World War for the buildings we currently occupy to be built upon. There is trauma, and all of this cannot be washed away in an education system. So this is where I think once more we're looking back at this text and seeing how fantastic it is that is sort of theorizing the introduction of critical race theory. It is coming in and starting to question and debate with its own existence. Even to a controversial standpoint, Du Bois is also looking at other members of his community and going, why aren't you advancing like me? And I'm not saying that this is a good way to address it, but it is also the beginning of looking at your own society and going, wait a minute, what is happening here?
I guess kind of what you're saying about this idea of progress, and you know, we won't get into it right now, I guess, but you're seeing this happen today. But Du Bois is also naming it in this text of, okay, something big happens, you know, a legal thing is put into place, or, you know, emancipation of slaves, this kind of thing. But then the real social work has not been done. That means actually slaves are now freed, but people still see them as slaves. That didn't change overnight, you know. And when you were talking, dipbuk, earlier about the real, like, where do people live? How do they have money? How do they get a job? How is any of this stuff done? And you still have stuff like this today, you know. This is why you're kind of seeing a rhetoric that comes up in black thinking, but also indigenous thinking and other kind of places, is this idea that the state will never be the place where you seek your freedom. It cannot free you because, again, this social work has not been done, and it's still not been done today, you know. That's why you're seeing rights be taken away.
Exactly, and the inheritance of these hateful rhetoric, because Du Bois is going. I forgot where the quote is from, but like the entire system's corrupt. The entire thing is corrupt because, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation was introduced as he's being born, but what of the children that are raised in the South to stay hateful? This is why the American Civil Rights Movement happens. These are not the original people from the American Civil War, it's their descendants. These things don't die. You have to change education, you have to change society, you have to integrate, or these things are just going to continue and just create new words, new terms. It's happening right now. Yeah.
Yeah, when you say that, it reminds me of chapter 7 when he mentions just fleetingly Sam Hose, also known as Sam Wilkes, and the way that Sam Hose was killed. When you look the name up, the history of Sam Hose and also other people that were killed around about that same time, in that same area, in that same location, it was incredibly violent, terrible. But this violence, this system of allowing this violence to take place is intergenerational. And so it's not just Du Bois's time, but his grandparents' time, his parents' time, and also the time preceding Du Bois. So it's an ongoing nightmare. It's one that he can not awake from.
And I just want to add a point about the intergenerational. Maybe people, I guess they are, I'm on my soapbox, I'm already. But when you see things in the media currently, and you will still be seeing them by the time this comes out, definitely, you're seeing things about people targeting schools and the education of children. That is for a reason, because it does not allow this intergenerational work to be done, right? Children learn from their parents, and if their parents are, I guess, talking kind of hateful rhetoric, if the child has nowhere else to learn from, they will not learn these things. And then by the time they're older, sometimes it's too late. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say that, take it seriously when they're targeting schools.
This work has made me think back on my Florida education. And I remember when we were traveling outside of Orlando, where we lived, it changed dramatically. You want to talk about a color line, there is a color line. As soon as you leave Central Florida, it is swampland. And I remember we were eating food, we were sitting down, and this older man was talking about the American Civil War, and he kept saying, "It ain't over till it's over." And we were like, it's been 100 years, my guy. I think it's a bit over. But this is inherited ideology. And it's things that just won't go away. I'm not surprised that what's happening currently is in Florida. Florida is the weirdest southern state. It's the only state you have to drive north to be in the south. But it has historically been a ground of all of this. Even as a kid, the Klan was still about. So we are a bit soapboxy. We've kind of lost ourselves in the page.
Then on the other side is that when you have the likes of Du Bois having to talk about what he's experiencing, his life, intergenerational trauma that he is embodying, is hard to express. And I think back to myself, and when I write about race or express my own experiences, it's hard. Sometimes I often will stutter. My brain does shut down. I do go into meltdown. I do lose my train of thought. And all of this, I wonder if there is this intergenerational trauma that is difficult to elucidate, difficult to express, and leads to this staccato rhythm that then is difficult to follow. So it's, on the one hand, yes, there is this white supremacy culture, but on the other hand, there are a group of people that have this intergenerational trauma that's difficult to express. And more often than not, when I'm teaching in a class, I'll see my students, when their skin looks similar to mine, there is silence when we talk about race. And when there is a trauma that is intergenerational, I wonder if that's a manifestation.
And I think that's also a bit of a country difference, Because in the States, at least from my experience, I want to highlight that part. When we talk about race, we talk about it quite loudly. I attended uni in the States from 2014 to 2017, so things are now legally changing where you can't talk about race. And I think the fear is sourcing from the fact that we did talk about race in classrooms. We weren't afraid to speak up, and we weren't afraid to correct the professor, because in fact, we were paying for them to be there. And say what you will about the American education system, most of it is correct, and it is transactional. But students, at least at my uni, were not afraid of speaking up, even with consequences. And, Du Bois is also a big representative of speaking up. This is a very American mentality. I don't think this text could have been written in the UK. I don't think this text could have been written anywhere else but the United States at this time period.
I wonder if this is why stuff about the UK comes out later than, I guess, these conversations that are happening in the US. And I don't know, from my own experiences, there is this kind of culture of silence or discomfort, I guess, is a better way of putting it. You don't want to, I don't know how to explain it.
There's a culture of appropriateness here that is very unique.
Yeah, people are also, I guess, and this is homogenizing, I guess, but people are they don't want to talk about their feelings. But that is with everything, right? But that especially becomes a problem when you have stuff like this, where you have students who are afraid to speak in classrooms. I've had it where I have colleagues who were teaching in the UK for the first time, and I said, I want you to be prepared for the silence that is going to happen in these classrooms. And they were like, oh, no, I've taught before, it's gone like this in this place, and everybody, the speaking back to the teacher, that just does not, in my experience, that's not really ever happened.
As you mentioned that, I was just looking up Equiano and Oluda Equiano, who eventually came to England and settled actually not very far from where I live, in Suffolk. He got married there to a white lady, and but the church where he got married, there is very, very little prominence given to his presence. But Equiano, 100 years before Du Bois even, wrote a book, but that book he wrote it in England using his lifetime's savings, which was incredibly expensive, but it's called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oluda Equiano, or Gustavo Vassa, the African. That's the name of the book, but this book is not known. It's nowhere near as popular even as Souls.
Yeah, and I think it's Du Bois's elitist mentality that makes him able to also do this in this time period. Because now we have the comfort of being able to go, no, shut up, to a professor if you want. You shouldn't, don't do that. But you can. But, he's coming in from Harvard. He's coming in from the University of Berlin. He's coming in from spaces where he has seen his white colleagues be able to speak freely and comfortably, and he's just going back behind that veil and going, why aren't we doing the same thing? So this is where his beef with Booker T. Washington is also quite significant. He has not just the education, but he has the guts and he has the drive to call someone out by name. Someone that he did support for a bit till the day of publication. He supported this man. But that is an extremely privileged position to be in. And I think it subconsciously establishes a way of speaking back culture in the United States, especially in the African American community. And it's why they're stereotypically seen as outspoken or obnoxious or whatever by a lot of people, because they just won't sit down and take it because they don't have to and they shouldn't have to.
I just wanted to mention, just before we move on to Booker T. Washington and the beef, I just wanted to mention Sorrow Songs is coined by Du Bois in this text, so it's the first time it's used. So sorrow songs, the definition is the suffering and unjust treatment of enslaved African Americans during the period of slavery in the United States, and the melodies and lyrics conveying sadness, and they were very direct about what it was to be enslaved. But he says in the kind of forward to the book, quote, some echo of haunting melody from the only American music which welled up from black souls in the dark past, end quote. So I just thought it was another term we needed to quickly mention.
Yeah, and it also, dare I say, it's a quick reference to our episode on Deleuze and Guattari, where they even mention in their book a connection to sorrow songs. They called it African American music, but that's what they're referencing. And also it's to tie in a bit more music theory, but that is for future us or for yourselves to find out.
Or for you to request if there's anything specific.
Give us names and deets. But there's also the blues. There's also soul. There is an association with very deeply troubling identity within the music of African Americans. And I don't think it is unrelated to the popularization of jazz and all of this other music that then becomes a commodity that is coming out of the United States and hitting these other countries, especially countries that have been affected through colonialism.
So if we move to talking about Du Bois's beef with Booker T. Washington, so to give a little tiny biography of Booker T. So Booker T. Washington was an American educator, author, orator, and was an advisor to several presidents of the United States, and was born in 1856 and died in 1915. So was, I guess, Du Bois's kind of contemporary. And in 1881, Washington established the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which by 1900 was the largest post-secondary school for African Americans in the world. So Washington's quite well known for something that happens in September of 1895, when Washington delivered a short address at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta, known as the Atlanta Compromise, and this kind of address appeared to surrender any claim to voting and equal rights for African Americans and accepted the reality of racial segregation. So it was controversial, shall we say. But it actually still appealed to many African American small business owners, farmers, and educators because of this kind of pragmatic approach to race and racial segregation. And so there was a friendship and kinship between Du Bois and Washington, and as such, Du Bois actually gets seen by militant black intellectuals and political activists as not being radical, with some even claiming that Du Bois was not to be trusted in these spaces because of this friendship and, I guess, support of Washington. And so one of the chapters in Souls is called Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others, and because of the inclusion of this chapter, Souls is actually perceived to be a more radical challenge to Jim Crow, and I'll let Paula define that in a minute. But interestingly, this chapter was only included, or this essay was only included as the book manuscript was being prepared for shipment in 1902 or kind of early 1903. Du Bois made the decision to insert the chapter on Washington. So he did so, he claims, kind of years later, because he felt increasingly uncomfortable with the statements of Washington's position. But it's important to note they were still in communication and kind of on friendly terms at this time.
As you mentioned, the International Exposition, I was looking at human zoos, and so at this exposition, you have people from all over the world coming, presenting. Du Bois is there. In an exhibition not far from where Du Bois is, you have the human zoo, and one of the exhibits is Deepest, Darkest Africa. And so on one hand, you will have Du Bois talking about emancipation, education, humanness that goes beyond just the white race. And then on the other hand, you have Booker T. Washington saying, actually, black people we'll go on to what Booker T. Washington starts to argue, but it's very different.
Yeah, all these things are happening at the same time. I was even thinking about, you mentioned that like the World's Fair, while like Frederick Douglass is giving a speech, like, you know, there's like other exhibitions from different countries that are just literally caging people.
Yeah.
But Jim Crow, what a horrible transition. The Jim Crow laws were state and local laws introduced in the southern United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that enforced racial segregation. Jim Crow being a pejorative term for an African American. Such laws remain in force until the 1960s. So Jim Crow basically assures separate but equal, but there's no equal. Jim Crow is a great scapegoat for the South to treat people horribly. And Booker T. Washington is basically saying, okay, we can make separate but equal work for us. We can make this work because that means we're going to establish our own Black businesses. We're going to keep the money within our communities, and we're going to assure that we're getting paid fairly because we're giving each other's jobs. So this is creating a micro community. But Jim Crow also reinforces the ideas that Black people and African Americans are lesser than. So while they have their own spaces, they're not equal to white spaces because they don't have the same access to land, they don't have the same access to the same banks. At some point in the early post-American Civil War period, they had their own currency, so even like the currency couldn't be used to purchase this land. And Jim Crow also assured that if a Black business was becoming a little bit more powerful than the white counterpart, that they had leeway, I think is the best way to call it, because it's technically not legal, but they still did it. They had leeway to destroy that business or destroy that community. So this is where our boy Du Bois is coming in and going, but we're not equal. We're separate but lesser than.
So we want to talk a bit about religion and the church, and specifically Du Bois's relationship to the church. And as you may know from previous episodes, I don't know anything about religion. So I'm passing this on to Paolo.
Yeah, so there's one specific chapter in this book where it really looks into the established Southern baptism that exists within Black spaces in places like Atlanta specifically, and how Du Bois sort of speaks quite negatively of these sort of spaces. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, there is a North and South divide, but Southern baptism is its own thing. Like, there is no way to describe it. It has its own vestment, it has its own culture and reverence, and it's a beautiful space. But how Du Bois is sort of interacting with it, he's looking at it like a space that's sort of stuck in its past. So he talks about sort of the reappropriation of African tradition and replacing the multiple gods in the mythology with Christianity, and finds the entire event of religious service to be sort of a bombastic thing of the past that should have stayed in the past. And just the words that he uses to describe it is sort of like carnivalesque in a way. And he sort of cements it as like a relic of the past. And where I kind of wasn't sure was if he hated the institution of religion itself, or the fact that the preacher acted as a community leader in the South, and that if the community leader said yay or nay, people would just follow it. So if a preacher was working against the education of people, would that be the problem with Du Bois, or is it just the institution of religion and being lost in something that cannot be proven?
So this quote I saw on page 44, He says, in the black world, the preacher and teacher embodied once the ideals of this people, the strife for another and a juster world, the vague dream of righteousness, the mystery of knowing. But today, the danger is that these ideals, with their simple beauty and weird inspiration, will suddenly sink into a question of cash and a lust for gold. So is the problem there about the relationship between the church and money? Mm-hmm. Is that the issue? And then when you're talking about the preacher, this community leader who could very easily, I guess, exploit the people in their communion.
Yeah, which happens a lot with megachurches, specifically in the South. Obviously, the megachurch didn't yet exist. That is more of a product of, believe it or not, cable television. Yeah, it's a wild side quest in American politics, truly. But it's the beginning of preachers believing in this, there is a specific name for it, that's why I'm...
Prosperity
theology.
Yeah.
This is a uniquely American situation. But in a way, he's sort of seeing it start about this time period. But it doesn't really become a thing till later on in the 80s with the rise of the conservative religiousness through Ronald Reagan and all that. Not that he was, but he was sort of in that movement. But there is this sensation and community around religion in the South that doesn't exist anywhere else and is still evident today. There is a very specific Baptist vestment in the South associated with the Black community. The looks serve. Like, I cannot explain how good this clothing is, but it's also clothing made by the Black community for the Black community for these specific events. So it is also keeping the money internal. Here's where I really disagree with Du Bois. I think, I'm not a religious person, but it is a way to connect people and to have community and to have each other's support. And he's coming at this from a very elitist contact, and it's also disregarding the fact that the South, it's its own culture. He's coming in from the North where this doesn't exist. He's being classist and elitist, and he's also just making himself sound better than these people. Because I understand that his worry is the exploitation of vulnerable people. But also he's completely disregarding already an established culture and of celebrations around God and the covenant and all these things. However, that is not to say that there is an argument to be made with the preacher and the teacher concept that he introduces here.
As you say that, I was thinking, if Du Bois is suspicious of people that have high clerical positions and priests, etc., I wonder if that what he's doing is going back to his ancestry and heritage, where chieftains and heads of villages in Africa will have been complicit in enslavement for monetary gain or for the gain of various accoutrements, gifts, etc., armaments, whatever, for their beef that they had with neighbours. And then he's seeing these high clerics in the South and thinking, well, they could quite easily sell their community down the river, so to speak.
Yeah, there's also the divine right of kings, where the monarch figure is a direct descendant of God, so it goes into also other white supremacist ideals of this. Especially during that time, he was coming in from Germany, where there was still a Kaiser. He's seeing the established Anglican Church here. He went down to Italy. He was seeing the power of Rome. He also saw the complete abandonment of Catholicism. So he's also seen the effects of having the preacher be the teacher and also the leader. So it's a lot of hats to wear on one person who's also in charge of the finances. You're 100% correct.
Okay, we've been recording for a little while now, and I think it is best if we kind of wrap up for today. So I kind of want to have a discussion now about how we feel about this text as a whole, especially in light of our discussions, and what do we feel this text's relationship is to the present.
I know I mentioned it earlier, so I'm just going to mention it again one more time. I think this text highlights that times really haven't changed. We're having a rise in neo-fascism, we're having books banned, and even, Tennessee failed to truly pass this, but I think they're trying to take it up to the Supreme Court. But basically making mixed race marriages be illegal again. So the rise of separate but equal is coming back into vogue. And I don't think it is at all surprising that this is also integrated with the issue presented with like transgenderism right now. And it is a rolling ball it is a snowball effect of a bunch of issues coming in together. So I think us reading this text has not only been enlightening, but it's also showing that this frustration is warranted, it needs to be further analyzed, and it needs to be continued. We need to continue to be frustrated with what's occurring. And I won't go into detail about it because we're running out of time, but I think the perfect book that can summarize this is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander from 2010. When this book came out, there was absolute uproar. I remember working at a coffee shop that sold books in the States, and people felt a lot of things. And we were selling this book in the South, in the state of Florida. And yes, it was Orlando, Florida. But to call something the new Jim Crow is also putting forward that mirror again onto society and into the United States that we're currently living in, and people are very uncomfortable. And this one does not start the book with gentle reader.
I think I'm glad I read it. I'm glad we're discussing it and that I'm here with you. It's been a pleasure. And I wish that this book would be used more frequently in sociology. I think that it's one of those books that is kind of off topic and additional reading, if you will, if you have time, but I wish that it would be used more frequently and more central to sociology.
We didn't get a chance to touch on it really in our discussions, but one of the key points that I think, is interesting to think about in relation to today is this idea of economic injustice. So the way Du Bois writes about it is this idea of enslaved people were freed, but then they were bound into this kind of economic slavery. And, I don't have any sources or anything for you at the minute, but I think this idea of economic injustice is still a huge, enormous issue today. You still see whole neighborhoods that just don't have the same resources or support as other neighborhoods, and let's say whiter neighborhoods, shall we say. And so I think this is something that you can really take forward to today.
The current cost of living crisis, the rising student debt, where in the States is just an insane amount of money, but also seeing the United Kingdom replicate the same system and bound not just to people of color, but also middle to lower class white people into this sort of debt servitude, if you will, is quite shocking. And it's making it so education and basic living standards are only possible for the elite and the exceptionally lucky.
The other thing we didn't really get a chance to mention, but I think is worth kind of leaving you on or getting you to think about, is Du Bois's kind of lack of discussion of black women and the rights and the role of black women within his time period, but also today. There's a long history of black feminist thinking that's happened since this point, but I think it's worth kind of bringing up. I looked around a bit, and this is from Wikipedia, so do not quote me or Wikipedia, but they say that Du Bois actually supported women's rights and women's suffrage throughout his writings, but there were some things he kind of held back on. And yeah, that's kind of what I have to say on that.
Yeah, his treatment of black women is very interesting because they're not mentioned or seldomly referred to, if referred to. And I think it's also laced with a very complicated narrative. That is something that we really need to consider before we cry out misogyny, which is when black men got the right to vote, white women used that as a way to seek out their own suffrage movement in the United States because they saw black men as lesser than. They said, how are you allowing these people to vote and not us? So there's also a big reason why he is avoiding the mentioning of women in this regard. So I'm not saying it's correct, none of us are, but it is coming in from a place of trauma in which white women tears are weaponized. To end on a much lighter note, we for the last couple episodes, we really have been doing fan fiction. Obviously, this is not going to be one where we do fan fiction because that would be absolutely rude. But we do have a couple media things to shout out. For mine, it is an episode from the Dick Van Dyke Show, Season 3, Episode 1, called That's My Boy, ? From the 1960s. And it is this episode in which Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore have a baby, they give birth to it, but the nurse is constantly confusing them with the couple next to them in the hospital. So Dick Van Dyke gets this idea that, oh my god, I think our babies were switched. So the entire episode he's like, oh my god, no, I think the babies were switched, I think this is all wrong. And they asked the hospital for the information of the other couple next to them. And they were like, yeah, let's call them up and make sure that like this baby doesn't look like the other couple. So the couple comes in and it is a really well-established black family. And Dick Van Dyke is sort of like egg on his face. He's like, oh, yeah, our babies weren't switched. And the father kind of makes it a point like, yeah, you think? And the reason I wanted to use this episode rather than like a piece of modern media is because this was created during the American Civil Rights Movement. And this episode was really carefully structured because they wanted to show a white and black family sharing the same space and being able to laugh together and not really focus solely on what's happening in the world. It was a really clever way of fighting the network, fighting a lot of racist people at this time, and it elicited one of the longest laughs in live recording.
Dipbuk, do you have anything to plug? Anything you want to shout out? Anything you've done? Or will do?
I'm running Network for Ethnic Minority Postgraduates under the Doctoral College's website, and I'm also, hopefully I'll teach criminology next year, so if you're interested in studying that'd be great. Hopefully I'll see you on one of my modules or one that I'm teaching.
Okay, cool. Thank you for listening, everybody. Thank you, and we will see you in the next one.
Yes, goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information, and please rate, follow and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.